welcome to this program, which is essentially a workshop. It's much less formal than what we usually do with Beyond Earth. You know, if you attended our webinars, they're very well structured and so forth. In this regard, it's a workshop where we will be looking at a particular model for enabling the possibility of financing large-scale infrastructure and habitat projects, including, of course, communities beyond Earth. So which is the ultimate objective. What I want to do is, let me just share a couple of slides with you before we get into this for the benefit of everyone. Let me see, I just got to keep admitting. I have to just keep admitting people, but I'm just going to share a couple of slides. And we do really just want to get into this. But just so that everyone has a sense, and we're all on the same page in terms of what we're doing here, this is a project of the Beyond Earth Institute organization, nonprofit think tank that was established last year to promote policy recommendations that specifically deal with creating or enabling the establishment of communities beyond Earth. Let's see here. I'm trying to advance this. Let's try it this way. Okay. I'm assuming you all could see the slides. Last week we kicked off an initiative to do just what I said, which is to look at financing options for large-scale space infrastructure and habitat projects. And we had this great panel. Some of these folks are involved here today. Okay. This project, in brief, is we're looking to identify financing mechanisms that could be made available for such initiatives or such projects. We want to review and evaluate proposed models for financing large-scale infrastructure projects. So that's sort of what we're starting here. The criteria is that these proposals must be well considered. We're hosting a workshop for each. This is one of those workshops. We have evaluators that are looking at this qualitatively in terms of what's going on today, and then quantitatively, we're asking them to fill out a questionnaire afterwards. So as you'll see, just to give you a sense of what's going to happen today, we're going to hear a presentation about 20 or 30 minutes on this particular proposal, and let me just, we'll hear a proposal for 20, 30 minutes. Then the evaluators will ask questions, will react to that, will give their input based upon a set of criteria. Here's our evaluators, by the way, but I do want to just jump to this set of criteria. So, which includes comprehensiveness and completeness, chances for success, financial soundness, sense of diversity, and does it enable communities beyond Earth, or to the extent to which it does. Our evaluators right now are Jeff Matthews, Hoyt Davidson, Meagan, Crawford, Sidney, Nakahoda, and Calnan. Jeff and Meagan are not with us today, but they will be evaluating this based upon the recording. So we appreciate that. We appreciate all the evaluators. This is our schedule of workshops. You're welcome to, those who are attending today are welcome to come back and join us for the subsequent ones. One is next week on the 29th, and then the 7th of July. But I do want to say that that this is primarily the evaluators that I showed you are the ones who are going to be primarily asking the questions. So I please ask everyone else to keep your microphones on mute. However, you are welcome. Everyone is welcome to put questions in the chat field, and our evaluators will be checking the chat field and pulling out those questions that they feel are relevant. And we'll generally capture all those questions, and we'll give Michael a chance to respond to those either in writing or on the call here. What's going to happen is this recording is going to be summarized by our two volunteers, Sai Sankirth and where is it, Jonathan? Where's Jonathan? Jonathan, yeah, Thorvilson, and two folks that are working with us on this, and that will be rolled in along with the other models and the other workshops that'll be rolled into a report that we will be producing by the end of the summer, early fall. So look forward to that. So with that, let's get into this. What I'd like to do is to, I would like the evaluators to very briefly introduce yourself, and then we will introduce the Michael Kesselmiller, who will present the model. So with that, why don't we start with you, Sidney?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, my name is Sidney Nakahoda. I'm a founder and general partner of Seldor Capital. We are a pre-seed fund based out of New York City that invests in space technologies and their applications. I'm also a lecturer of international and public affairs at Columbia University. And apart from these two responsibilities, I have been at the forefront of some initiatives here in New York that have intended to build a space community here in the city.
Great. And Hoyt?
Hi, I'm Hoyt Davidson. I'm the managing partner of a space industry-focused investment banking boutique called Near Earth LLC. So that's my day job. Also on the board of the Space Foundation, and was until very recently their treasurer and still on the finance committee. And I'm on the board of the National Space Society. Until recently was the VP of development, and now I'm mostly focusing on their policy committee and space policy advocacy.
Great. And Gary?
I'm Gary Calnan. I'm co-founder and CEO of Cislunar Industries. I have a background in finance and entrepreneurship and a sort of lifelong passion for space. Found my way into the space sector in 2017 through the International Space University. And that's where Cislunar Industries was born. You know, our vision for Cislunar Industries is to provide, process and provide critical metals to meet the needs of our customers in space and on the surface of celestial bodies, really anywhere in the solar system. So we want to become the metal processors of what we see as a future cislunar economy and an industrial cislunar economy and solar economy, I guess. So obviously this topic is near and dear to my heart. So happy to be here. Thanks, Steve.
Great. Okay. Well, now I'd like to introduce Michael Kesselmiller. And actually, Michael, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and then I'm going to then I'm going to make you the host, which will allow you to share your slides. Okay.
Great.
So here you go. Okay. Let me see here. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself
while
I get you all set up.
Yeah. My name is Michael Kesselmiller. I work with basically I work with governments, private sector companies, and nonprofits, international development organizations, and so forth, as an advisor on special jurisdictions. So I'm a lawyer by training, and I advise on economic policy a lot. But my main focus is on how to design institutions or create governance frameworks for special zones of different kinds. That includes special economic zones, or sometimes industrial parks, or free trade zones. And I like to help clients use these zone models as ways of experimenting with better policy, with better institutional arrangements that can serve as a pilot for the larger country around it. So I've worked in about 25 different countries helping design the institutions for different zones and drafting legislation and writing policy documents and stuff. And so the space issue has become really interesting to me as somebody who is a big believer in the potential of kind of creating new spaces for better governance, for better policies to take hold. And you know, the surface area of the moon is roughly equivalent to about the land area of the Americas. And it's one of these, you know, going to the moon and settling it is going to be one of these huge transformative steps in the history of humanity. And I hope that we do it right. And that's what I've been working on this idea with Hoyt and some other people, other space experts who've helped me develop this concept.
Thanks, Michael. Do you have the ability to share your screen at this point?
Yeah.
Okay. Just go for it.
I think I do. Let's see here. Can you all see the first slide here?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so great. So as I was saying, I want to talk with you about the Lunar Development Cooperative, or the LDC is the acronym, which would be a way of developing the public services needed to sustain lunar settlement. And the problem, as we all probably know in this chat room, is that infrastructure in space is extremely expensive. And at the same time, though, infrastructure is necessary in order to reduce the costs for all of the businesses and other activities that might take place on the moon. But any analysis of the potential returns on space infrastructure investment are often too uncertain or too far off in the future. And I think that one of our problems is we're looking at infrastructure primarily in terms of the usage fees that it could generate. In other words, we think of having customers pay per use of the infrastructure, whether it's Earth-based services, orbital refueling stations, launch pads, landing pads on the moon, etc. But the problem is that charging per use for this infrastructure is not going to generate enough revenue to justify the upfront financing. And probably using government budget appropriations is also probably not going to be enough or politically feasible. However, one interesting thing about infrastructure is that it creates so much more value than can be captured through usage prices. In other words, it externalizes a lot of value. And if only we could capture this externalized value to help mobilize the investment. And this is where the LDC comes in. The LDC is a membership organization that provides infrastructure and other public services to support lunar activities. It would be an investment vehicle in which any person in the world, private to national governments, can invest with 49% or less of the shares available to as many governments as possible around the world, and 51% or more of the shares available to everyone else. Now, what makes it different from other models is how it earns revenue from its services. The LDC primarily collects what we're calling location-based service access fees, or LSAFs. What this means is that if an entity intends to go to the moon, whether a government or a private company, they can opt into receiving LDC services by becoming a member and obtaining a service access license from the LDC. A service access license can be issued for any duration up to 40 years. And this license is identified with a particular location on the moon that the person has chosen. So if company A or government B lands on the moon in a spot that they choose, the LDC can offer them a membership and a license, which they can take if they want to, and which entitles them to access LDC infrastructure and services while using that particular site. And the fee that people pay for their licenses is priced at the market value of the right to receive services at that particular site. This amount is basically indirectly tied to the value of the spot on the moon that the person is using. We'll unpack that soon. But first, what are we talking about when we refer to services? Well, we mean a range of things that facilitate lunar activities and ultimately a thriving society on the moon, as you see here. So in the first place, we need to ensure that we have the basics for getting there and keeping going. So that means things like orbital satellites for communications or remote sensing and other things. And potentially low Earth orbit refueling stations that are available to LDC license holders for free or at a discounted price, emergency facilities, supplies, and rescue services, insurance, things like that. And it could help you out if you have conflicts with to sort out with foreign governments or your own governments, potentially with clearance or authorizations. And next, you see this whole category of surface operations, such as supplying power in any number of ways. You may need landing pads and berms that prevent dust from blowing everywhere. Surface transport if you need to move people or supplies around. Or how about one classic feature of old mining towns, a trading outpost. A place, where you can get your new pickaxe and pair of boots that have grown holes in them, or perhaps maybe the equivalent for the moon. And eventually there might be a full-fledged commodities exchange with minerals being traded. And in this scenario, the LDC really becomes the space age equivalent of a mining town operator. And then we can start to create the building blocks for a thriving society in these two rule of law columns here to the right. Note that from the very start, the LDC could create a registry, since it is already issuing licenses defining the boundaries of the areas that people are using. And also, these license holders all have an obligation as part of their license agreement not to interfere with other people's uses. And that means that each license holder is protected by the obligations the LDC places on all its other license holders. And over time, these obligations could become international norms of non-interference. And in that way, even non-license holders would have obligations not to harm others. And also over time, you see that the LDC could regularize activities, developing standards for technical matters or other operations. It can also naturally provide some regulation, since it is both the incentive to ensure people don't harm each other and the long-term interests in the lunar commons. And it also has the ability to regulate through its contracts with its license holders, voluntary contracts with them. Also, along with these functions, it could ensure dispute resolution is available, such as arbitration bodies on the moon or perhaps courts. And interestingly, it could record the decisions of these arbitration bodies, so they might be used as precedent for future court or arbitration decisions, which is essentially the beginning of the common law jurisprudence on the moon. Okay, now, how is this paid for? We're going to have to spend billions of dollars, after all, to build what we described, even with probably more than billions, even over the long run, even with cost-saving innovations. Innovations, by the way, that the LDC has a strong incentive to develop. I should become clear later. But in any case, the capital and operating costs are going to be large. How are these going to be recouped? So here's where we talk about the location-based service access fees. Remember, a license fee is set based on the market value of the ability to access LDC services while using a particular spot on the moon. Now, if you're asking yourself, how do you determine this value, this market value, in a fair and accurate way? And that's a very good question. Well, one option is for the fee to be going up and down every year in response to what an independent valuer says the value is. But I think that most lunar occupants are probably going to need more predictability of their costs than that, though. So in most cases, at the start of a license, the fees will be laid out in a schedule telling the license holder what they will need to pay for every year of the license. And this fee schedule will rise, or it could fall, but probably rise over the license term based on the estimated rise in market value as determined at the start of the license. So you do an estimate at the start of the license. So there's an example of fee schedules for 3 different sites here in the slide, sites A, B, and C, and all are valued differently, perhaps based on the location features, whether maybe A has a nice permanently shadowed crater in it, a lava tube, and so forth, and on different levels of, also on the different levels of service provision that the LDC is providing in that area. Maybe there's a great launch pad nearby or something. Okay, then when the term of the license is up, a new fee schedule is set based on the estimated values over the subsequent term. Now, you may be asking yourself, yeah, but how do you know what the market value will be that this estimate is based on? Can we trust the LDC to be fair and accurate when it makes this estimate? And the simple answer is, we actually don't need to trust it. We could let the participants themselves, the license holders themselves, determine it. And one way could be secondary market pricing. This could be used, for instance, if there are lots of people who acquire 20 or 30 or 40-year licenses, but end up selling them before the license is up because their startup venture fails or whatever. And others take up the remaining years of that license. And what they sell it for gives you a point of comparison to use for determining the value of all the licenses, other licenses that are similar to it. But even if we don't have this secondary market information, we could use a self-assessment model. And I could point to a few different potential options for this, but one is an auction. In an auction, oh, I guess I should have, somebody wants to come in here, sorry. Okay, I just admitted somebody. Since I'm now the host, I have responsibilities here. Okay, so if we do an auction, potential interested lunar entrepreneurs or research stations or whatever, who are all interested in operating at a particular location, let's call this one Site A, they would submit a fee schedule for what they would be willing to pay for a service access license at Site A, with each setting, with each one setting their own desired length of term for the license, and the highest bidder wins based on the net present value of future years. So you've got an example here of 3 different bids for Site A, and to give you an example of what that looks like. And at the end of the term, what if the existing license holder doesn't renew it? If perhaps it can't afford the license fees anymore, and it's built all of these improvements on the land, on the surface, all the assets that it can't just pick up and take with it. So this person's got habitats and mines and big heavy equipment at a site they've been using for the last 30 or 40 years, and their license is up. What do? Well, first, I think we should put a nudge, put a thumb on the scale when it comes up for renewal. So perhaps if there is an auction, they get maybe a 10% discount off the highest bid. And secondly, we could find ways of perhaps accommodating multiple users at that particular site, including the existing license holder. The LDC could sort that out. Finally, if that isn't possible and the existing license holder has to leave, they would have to be compensated for whatever they leave there. So the new license holder would pay the appraised value of the habitats and so forth into a trust, and then that would be paid to the owner. And in this way, no one loses any of the value they create. And this is really important. People are not paying a property tax on what they build. They don't pay a tax on the value that they add by mining or processing resources. They don't pay for the value they create at all. Only the raw underlying value of the area they are using, which is value that the LDC is primarily creating, because all of its services are increasing demand for that particular site there. So really the person is just paying the LDC for the value that the LDC has given it. Now, one thing that is needed to make this work is that the LDC needs to aim to make its services so helpful, at least in certain areas, that people consider them virtually indispensable. This could be done, say, by concentrating services in clusters of development on the moon. So areas where lots of license holders are starting to operate, maybe Lunar South Pole, or maybe there's other very attractive areas, but also offering some services on a global scale for anyone operating on the moon, perhaps orbital-based infrastructure and things like insurance. That way, at least you have certain clusters where there's really high-quality LDC services, and lots of people are going to want to become members and get licenses there. Now, what proof do we have, or what indication do we have that this might work financially? Well, as I said before, one thing we know about public services like this is that almost all of their value is externalized onto the commons, onto things like land, natural resources that are still in the ground, radio frequencies, spectrum, that they add so much value to these common pool resources that if this value can be internalized by the service provider, it should be more than enough, and in some cases much more than enough, to cover all the upfront costs for the services. So now here's an example from the time when the European descendants started migrating from the eastern to the western part of North America. And of course, there were lots of other people whose rights were ignored, unfortunately, during this time. But one thing we can observe from this time is the effect of the transcontinental railroads. There were, I think, 5 of them, that these railroads had on the value of the commons in the American West. So suddenly you had tens and hundreds of thousands of people who are now a new market who could pick up and move west. And the value of common pool resources like land and mineral rights soared. Now, try to calculate the value added to land, for instance, by the railroads alone over, say, the 60 or 70-year period after rail access. It would be astronomical. And the same thing has happened with many other public works projects, such as the Erie Canal and its effect on Manhattan and others, as well as the value of good governance itself. Consider the difference in the value of land in well-governed areas compared with poorly governed ones, say in the US or in Hong Kong compared with Nigeria or other places. Now, or Somalia. One estimate of the total value of land in the 48 contiguous states that I saw is it was $23 trillion, just as an idea. And of course, it's highly, very difficult to get an accurate measurement. Now, so what we're essentially talking about here is making the LDC somewhat like predecessors like the Virginia Company or the Hudson Bay Company in the 1700s. The difference is that, letting somebody else in, the difference is that these companies were given charters that allowed them to establish a monopoly exploiting a trade, say in furs over a big area. And there's policy problems with that. So with the LDC, we're making it like if the Virginia Company collected the rise in value of space in the eastern seaboard. That would have been immense. A group estimated that the value of land in just Manhattan, just the tiny island of Manhattan, not counting the value of the buildings or parks, but the underlying land value at about $1.74 trillion in 2014. That's roughly the GDP of Canada. Now, really high-performing governments and booming cities tend to use this model. The Hong Kong government collects land rent from all of its land through land leases, for instance. And the Hong Kong Transit Authority, in particular, runs one of the best functioning and most profitable metro systems in the world because its revenue comes from the land rents around the metro stops. The government of Singapore does similar things, and there's other lots of cities tapping into this form of financing. And this approach is is able to generate enough revenue to pay for the infrastructure over, say, especially over the long run than user fees would be. Now, granted, the returns might be 40, 50 years long, and that's longer than most investors are willing to wait. So what do we do about that? Well, first, in the case of the LDC, we can leverage the sovereign participation in the LDC to buy down the risk somewhat. Governments are better able to make long-term, riskier investments than private sector investors. This could be perhaps combined with like an OPIC model, as Hoyt has observed. And secondly, the LDC would also collect some usage fees from its infrastructure. This means that people would be paying for orbital refueling or telecommunications and so forth that the LDC has provided, and that would generate more near-term revenue for the LDC. But we're really looking to that really as a stopgap to cover the short term in the financial model before getting to the really large returns from location-based service access fees. And ideally, too, we'd have something like the government would be a guaranteed buyer of LDC services, too, like perhaps of orbital refueling to use for satellites or whatever, or landing pads and so on. So here's where we see a diagram of how this positive feedback loop could start spinning. We've got states and non-state parties putting their capital into the LDC as an investment, not as a grant or as a space budget appropriation, which means that there'd be a lot more funding available to invest in it. The LDC then uses this money to build infrastructure and other services. And then as demand for licenses start to grow, particularly at the sites the LDC has focused its services on, the LDC's income from location-based service access fees climb higher and higher. Most of this revenue goes back into the funding of still greater infrastructure and services, which fuels demand further, and on. But some of it goes to repay investors, giving them a return, which motivates them and others to invest still more in this venture to support the development of the moon. And as I mentioned, there are short-term options for generating revenue. And this model doesn't involve taxing. And now, one problem I want to talk about first, though, is that one problem I kept running into, especially in the beginning when I first began talking about this idea with people, was, and you might be thinking of this too right now, it's the property ownership problem in space. Lots of people out there say that Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty effectively prevents both national appropriation and private ownership of surface areas of the moon. Now, whether that's true or not, what I found is that it has enough clout that any landlord type business model for the moon is essentially dead out of the gate. And when I first started talking about this, or in an earlier formulation, that's essentially what it was like. The LDC would become this landlord, albeit a landlord that represents all the nations and people of Earth, but would be basically collecting rent from tenants. Then a breakthrough happened when we started adding a few elements to it. And the first element was making people voluntarily, having people voluntarily come into the LDC first with the areas they plan to use and they agree to pay, rather than the LDC first asserting some claim to certain areas of the moon. And second, people only pay for the access to LDC services. They can still settle anywhere they want to and not pay the LDC a penny. They just wouldn't receive LDC services while at that site. And this keeps the LDC competitive. It means that the LDC has got to deliver high quality services so that people consider them almost indispensable. And third, the typical control that a landlord has over the use of the land isn't really there in this model. The LDC is really just providing services and making sure that people don't harm each other over the long term, or harm the long-term needs of the lunar environment. Now, so essentially what we've done now in the end is we've taken the financial benefit of a landlord-tenant model, but without actually claiming to own the land. That way, we avoid all of the legal, political, and social problems of appropriation of the moon's surface. And that's why they are location-based service access fees and not rent, for instance. Okay, and they're not a tax either. And as a result, LSAPs don't really undermine any economic productivity because they don't take away the fruits of the lunar settlers' labor. Lunar settlers only pay for the value the LDC gives to the portion of the commons they are using. Essentially, it prevents people from collecting what they don't earn, from the economic rents, to use a technical term, that infrastructure and public services normally generate for landowners. Okay, and this is why the LDC model, I think, is not just a good way, not just a way to finance infrastructure, it's also good public policy. It tends to allocate spots to the moon to the people who will make the most productive use of them. And to see this point, I want to draw a distinction between two kind of other extremes, two other options. One option would be an international committee. Now, this entity would be set up by the UN perhaps, and would perhaps dole out access rights. This might be done like the UN Law of the Sea Convention, for instance. And the committee determines, everyone using the moon, who gets to use what spot and mine so much of what kind of resource. Well, the trouble I see with this approach is the process is slow. And it is driven not by who makes the most efficient use, even though that may be its stated intention, but by politics. And with all such systems, there's always corruption. People get rights not because they are the best ones for the site, but because they grease the wheel in some way or are beneficial for some political agenda. Then there's the option of first mover gets everything they can claim. This model speeds up the process for developing the moon probably much more than the first option, than the other option, because it can institute a land rush, much like was seen in the American West, in Australia, and other places. The downsides to this approach are you can get many people coming in to gobble up land and resources, sometimes profiting hugely just by waiting around for the boom to really settle in, and then selling. This is known as speculation, or by having other people pay you handsomely to work the land as some kind of serf, as we saw in like South and Central America. This often doesn't encourage efficiency of use, that is, use by the party who will make the best use of the resources, but rather encourages use by those with the money or the cunning and speed to get there first, regardless of what they do with it after getting there. Not only might this not be as efficient as we might desire, there's also a question out there of whether ownership is consistent with Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, like we mentioned earlier. So in the West, for instance, there's a lot of value created by railroads and American public institutions that went to people who added no value to the commons. They just got their first claim land and waited it out until they could watch its value rise. That's also called rent seeking in economic terms. So, but if we could channel just a fraction of that value increase into public purposes, it would have been very easy to fund rail across the continent, plus a lot of other good things too. could have probably compensated indigenous people better too. Now, I could have used a lot of other images to represent this. I chose to go with one of my favorite movies of all time, which is Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush. Pure cinematic genius. Now, granted, I want to make clear these two options do represent extremes. There are ways of making each approach a little better, such as an Intelsat model or the Homestead Act model. But the LDC presents us with the chance for allocating the commons in an entirely different way and comes very close to optimal efficiency. So under the LDC, we have people willing to pay the most to use a particular, the people who are willing to pay the most to use a particular spot, if they're to use LDC services at all, using that spot. That means you aren't going to have people using an excellent lava tube or a permanently shadowed crater with all sorts of wonderful resources, or a peak that receives almost constant sunlight, being permanently sat on by a government or by a private party that doesn't add much value to it. It doesn't do much with it. Why? Because only someone who can pay to put it to its best use would be willing to pay the fee associated with it. And if they're not doing that, if they're not generating enough revenue for that, it will go to somebody that does at the next license term. Now, notice how also that incidentally this prevents territorial appropriation by nations, which is a no-go under the Outer Space Treaty, at least provided they go along with the LDC model. So, and also notice how with this model, we've essentially linked the LDC's interests with the sustainable use of the lunar commons. That means that if the LDC allows the moon to be treated poorly, it's mined in a destructive or wasteful way, if there's war, if there's suffering and starvation, then demand for service access licenses will plummet and the LDC will suffer financially. If, on the other hand, it makes the moon a place where resources are mined in a way that considers the second and third and even seventh generation over the long term, if living conditions get better and better, then demand will soar and the LDC's investors will be very happy. And so the LDC will have an incentive to include provisions in its contracts with license holders on how to use resources in a way that won't cause harm and has an incentive to vigorously enforce those rules. Now, finally, I want to talk about one more public policy benefit to the LDC model. It's openness, inclusion, and international cooperation. We know from Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty that the moon is the province of all of us. The moon should be open to everyone. Now, the LDC does this by allowing everyone to contribute to adding value to the moon. One way of doing this is by making an investment in the LDC and becoming a shareholder. We allow anyone in the world to buy shares in the LDC, and we'd like these shares to be tradable on a platform with very low administrative costs if possible. So the minimum investment threshold might be as low as $1 or less. And also, we let nations from around the world invest as shareholders. Now, nations that don't have the resources to make large investments at first, namely developing countries, can purchase stock options in which they pay a minimal amount to lock in a price at which they can pay, that they can pay in the future to buy shares after they've grown in value. Not too different from like an employee stock option. And as I said earlier, we make state shareholders take up no more than 49% of voting control. So the LDC is not driven by political agendas of a powerful nation or a group of nations, but only on what makes economic sense. And economic sense in this model is linked to what makes social and environmental sense. And this should also make the LDC more innovative and cost efficient than we see in state-controlled institutions. We'll be looking at the bottom line more. Now, to make sure the LDC is really looking out for the long-term value addition to the lunar commons, we also have to regulate how much voting control any one shareholder can have. This prevents, say, a major space corporation or China or the US from buying up enough shares to steer the LDC to benefit its own political or, for private company, its own business interests instead of the long-term value of the LDC, which is linked to the long-term value of the lunar commons. And we also create a board of advisors in which any nation and indigenous people group can send a representative to weigh in on different matters and also control an inspector general to provide independent accountability. And finally, the LDC, oh, by the way, this also sort of naturally disincentivizes corruption too, because if somebody within the LDC is taking bribes or doing something corrupt, that's undermining the profitability of the LDC. And so you've got shareholders and a board of directors, a CEO that are going to be very, are going to stamp that out pretty quickly. And finally, the LDC doesn't exclude anyone from acquiring service access licenses to carry out operations on the moon. So anybody can get a license and operate on the moon under the LDC. Now, another point on this topic, not only should it be open to everyone, many people would say the moon should benefit everyone. Now, when I think about this question, I ask, how much should a person benefit relative to others? And with the LDC, we're creating a model where people benefit from the moon, not in proportion to how much they can take from it, but from how much they contribute to the value of the lunar commons. Remember, we've made it so the LDC's financial interests are tied to humanity's overall long-term interests in the moon. That means the returns on investment go to the parties that contribute the most to the LDC and through the LDC to the lunar commons. And finally, once the moon's population begins to grow and the LDC will set aside more and more of its shares as only available to residents of the moon. That way, the people who directly benefit from the LDC's services are the ones that steer it, that control it. That makes it a true cooperative. Also, once major upfront capital needs are taken care of and those investors have received a strong return, the LDC might switch to paying all of its profits potentially to lunar residents directly as some kind of citizen's dividend, or perhaps to financing the trips of people who can't afford to reach the moon, or to other efforts to ensure the benefits of the moon are shared by as many of us and by our descendants as possible. Okay, and just to conclude, I want to conclude with how we might get this off the ground. Well, I think we'd like to start with either angel investment or nonprofit funding that would enable us to do some more rigorous economic and financial modeling, so that we can make a very compelling case for why investors would want to join the LDC. From a government's perspective, I think we could present a very strong case that this is an option for getting into space that is far less costly because you're pooling funding to develop this infrastructure, and you've got a model for it that should generate a big return. And this enables governments to you can go to them and say, you don't have to use your space budget appropriations to build this big space, to build lunar infrastructure. You could invest, you could use like sovereign wealth funds that can be invested, and that's politically a lot more attractive because it generates a profit. We'd also like to simulate the LDC, and this helps us both raise seed capital and helps us raise revenue by the simulation, and it can serve as a laboratory for testing out what investments specifically the LDC should prioritize first, and what needs to change in the design of the model. So one thing is a massively multiplayer online game where people from thousands or tens of thousands of people around the world could be playing different roles under the LDC model. And by doing that, we sort of game out how the incentives sort of pull on people and what shapes out. Another is we'd like to test it on Earth-based lunar habitat experiments, such as like the Mauna Loa habitat that's going on. I think that Hank Rogers is doing on this call, and these things enable parties that are interested in going to the moon to participate in a version of the LDC on Earth. And also serving indigenous communities in the US, Canada, and New Zealand, and elsewhere. So some of the core people in the LDC are actually indigenous and have told me they're instinctively attracted to it because they find the approach that the LDC has to the lunar surface and the environment fits well with their traditional practices. Okay, that's it. I'm sure there'll be good questions. Love to carry on a discussion, love to hear your thoughts, and perhaps we can flesh it out more.
Hey, that's great, Michael. Really comprehensive, as I knew it would be. Before I turn this over to the evaluators, just a couple of comments. I do want to acknowledge the National Space Society. I know that they have been supportive of you, primarily or to a large extent through Hoyt Davidson. So I know he wants to have a disclaimer on that. I know that he's been involved with you, and he could speak a little further on that. But I do want to ask the evaluators now, as we move into that, and I don't know if you want to keep the slides up or not, but I do want to go around with the evaluators. You certainly, during the course of this, hopefully if you've developed your own set of questions that more or less align with the criteria that we've outlined. Don't feel like you have to be locked into that criteria either. But as an initial question, to the evaluators, I want to get your initial overall reaction to what Michael has shared, both in terms of what are the strengths and what are the potential weaknesses that you see with this plan. And I will go with you, Hoyt. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a fresh look at this and maybe have some additional comments. Hoyt, I will say, again, full disclosure, he has been involved with this project. So, but let me turn it over to you, Hoyt, to start this off.
Thanks, Steve. And this has, as Michael mentioned, it has evolved quite a lot over the last 2 years based on input from literally dozens of prominent people in the space industry. So it has and continues to get very detailed critiques and reviews. And it's not a finished product, and certainly more resources are needed, both financial and human, to sort of work out the details. But I do think in an environment where you can't have land ownership, that this is a very interesting model to create a valuable commons that grows and creates a virtuous cycle and continues to improve and is inclusive. So again, in an environment where you can't have land property rights, I think this is a very interesting model that everyone should give a lot of insight and support to. One thing I wanted to ask Michael, just to start off, there's, the U.S. came up with these Artemis Accords, and they are becoming popular and adopted by more and more countries. I wanted you to just talk a little bit about how the Artemis Accords might interface with an LDC, and if you see that as a benefit or there's issues, or maybe you can address that for a second.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably other people that are far more expertise in the Artemis Accords than I do. However, one nice thing about the Artemis Accords it's sort of this little bit more of a ground up like approach where nations are gradually kind of signing on to sort of a framework for how to ensure, prevent against like non-interference and of making sure that people have some level of rights to what they do on the surface of the moon when they're to go there. All these trends are positive, and what basically I see the LDC as sort of continuing in that trend and going quite a bit further with essentially kind of it's almost sort of along the way of the LDC operating. It creates this registry of locations that are essentially kind of allowing certain people to use a site, and creates standards for non-interfering. The approach here, I think, is that's better than the Artemis Accords, is that we're letting these standards sort of evolve over time, rather than them being sort of dictated by one particular nation or governments or an international body. And that's something that I find attractive, where we're letting sort of the LDC figure out what works in partnership with, by basically the LDC responding to what lunar occupants themselves are doing. And in that way, you're going to kind of have like the evolution of institutions on the moon that happens much more organically and happens in response to actual needs, and the solutions to those needs are better fit for better fit than would be if you've got like some international body or even a government or several governments dictating it. And maybe I kind of orbited around your question, but
no, That was good. Thanks.
All right, Gary, what's your reaction? Strengths, weaknesses?
You know, I like the approach. It's you know, I like the general sort of non-coercive approach to it all. You know, so there's no government involved in sort of causing people to engage in it. My biggest questions came out around, well, there was one in the beginning about who would actually provide the services that the LDC is doing. Is that like a whole bunch of private companies that are being contracted? So that's one side. But the other side was more fundamental, I think, which is, does this kind of agreement require the major space powers to sign on to it to be feasible? I mean, if you have China saying, yeah, nope, we're going to do our own thing, what stops them, or the United States for that matter, what stops them from just saying, well, we're going to land right here next to where your LDC exclusion zones are and do whatever we want?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that, so on the first one, yeah, the LDC would probably its best business model would be to contract providers to provide the whole range of services that the LDC is providing. I mean, there might be a case also for providing some services directly itself for something with its own employees, but so either option. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be a private company either. It could be, if there's a government or state-owned company, or for some reason is the best provider, they would do that. The approach here, though, that we're looking at is creating an entity, the LDC, that's got an incentive to be making the best business decisions in who provides the services. So they're looking at, you know, if there's a given piece of infrastructure they want to build a remote sensing satellite orbiting around the moon or something, they're going to go with whoever's going to provide the most value at the lowest cost, you know, rather than it being driven by a different, you know, political or corrupt motive or something, unlike a government. The LDC does not require nations to sign on. It's not a treaty-based organization, but it also still works even if major space players don't join on. Essentially, it could be, you know, it obviously works better if we've got as many different nations as possible. But even with just a few nations, especially if there's one or two, you know, spacefaring nations signed on, it's possible to kind of have this LDC running, and it's got users and stuff, and then maybe there's China or something that has a lunar base. Maybe there's Chinese companies that are mining resources or something, and they're not touching the LDC. They don't get services from the LDC. They do it all themselves. I kind of, in another document I sort of draw out kind of like a 50 or 60 year future history of the LDC, and there's a scenario where a big major spacefaring nation doesn't join on to the LDC, and I think that, you know, what we'd see over the long run is you see infrastructure in the LDC areas evolve much quicker, and the quality of services would grow much stronger, quicker than you would by a nation going it alone, because the nation just isn't going to be able to put enough money into it to match the amount of resources that the LDC could put in if it's with its much bigger market size of potential users, and by collecting location-based service access fees. And so you'd eventually see nations wanting to join on, and if there's nations that still hold out, and they're just going to be less desirable places to go on the moon, and so you're going to have more and more people, you know, wanting to go to sort of the LDC serviced areas of the moon.
Okay, we'll keep coming back around, but Sidney, why don't you go ahead, and then you all should just you know, we'll just keep asking questions as we move along. Sidney?
Yes, no. First, a great presentation, Michael. I really enjoyed learning about the concept, and I have so many reactions to it. So please feel free to interrupt me if I speak too much. I'm approaching this from two angles. One is my space entrepreneur and investors hat, and the other one is from the academic side. I would say that the former is very optimistic, is very excited, because it's I can see definitely the benefits for the stakeholders that I interact with, how they could benefit from it. And from the intellectual standpoint, this is a fascinating academic exercise, and I do believe that there are a lot of opportunities for us to think around structures that will enable Cislunar development. One thing, my first reaction is on the concept itself, right? The idea of creating a cooperative, and there have been some historical successes of cooperatives that can produce global impact. And the one that I think probably is most famous is the World Bank, which is not a financial institution, traditional financial institution per se, but it is a cooperative where you don't have a single owner. You have shareholders that are members of this consortium, right? So I think that the possibility of developing a cooperative is definitely there, but as we know, the devil is on the details. So I would like to approach this from three main political economic challenges. And by the way, don't take this so much as a source of criticism, but more like an initial ideas for a conversation. The first is on the incentive structure, right? And we know that for something of this magnitude to work, you need to attract anchor tenants, or you need to attract key players, whether they are some of the space powers or whether they are some of the largest corporations. But to bring them on board, I think it's going to be key for the success of a cooperative. The second element is coordination, right? We know that nowadays there have been several attempts to engage different actors in lunar activities, and now they are competing. So you have the Artemis, you have the Chinese and Russian initiative, and now in parallel you have the Moon Village. To what extent these different players that they have their own agendas would be willing to be part of this initiative? I think it's very important to figure out like how all these pieces come together. Finally, on the execution side, right? Definitely, I think the idea of establishing a consortium to execute projects on the moon, I think it is very appealing. Some of the concerns that I have is that how do you make sure that there's a fairness element that will prevent the largest members to take control of the agenda, right? Or how do you make sure that even though I think the ultimate goal is to democratize access to lunar activities, how to make sure that the overall agenda of the organization is not dominated by a few stakeholders, not necessarily the bigger ones, but the ones that are more articulated, right? And finally, this is very marginal, but the acronym LGC might be misleading. International affairs, like LGCs that we use for least developing countries, right? And every time you mention LGC, that was something that I was thinking about. I'm sure that won't be a problem, but just something that I wanted to bring out here.
Those are really great points. I love thinking about all this stuff from a political economy angle. In fact, that's my main concern with this stuff. And I agree with everything you said. Two things to respond to. Well, on the largest members, how do we prevent the largest members from controlling it? I didn't go into detail in the presentation, unfortunately, but one thing that would be part of the founding documents of the LDC would be limits on the amount of voting control that any one shareholder can exercise over the LDC. So you might have a cap of, say, no single nation can control more than 10% of voting power over the board of directors or something, and similar limits on any single private investor. By doing that, you prevent, a nation like China or any other nation wouldn't go into the LDC saying, oh, let's buy up enough shares, so then this becomes basically our little proxy or our sort of vehicle for influencing serving our own agenda on the moon. And you've hamstrung that attempt from the start, and instead said, so that a nation only invests in it because it's a chance to invest in being a part of a space infrastructure, and the nation can turn a profit from it. And that's essentially the model we're trying to create here. Is basically I want to link the profit of the LDC with overall social interests in the moon, and once we've done that, we want to make it so that each of the shareholders are really aiming at maximizing profit. So you don't have a shareholder that says we don't really care if the LDC's finances suffer as long as we're benefiting our own side interests. So it's sort of, you're protecting minority shareholders that way too by doing that. Also, would a nation be willing to join? I think that, you know, I sort of talked about like the nations that don't, the nations that want to go it alone would be at a major disadvantage in their ability to generate a return on their infrastructure investment if they have to build their own services that compete with what the LDC is doing. But I think that, personally, I think that we get a lot of buy-in from these sort of smaller, wealthy nations without major space programs yet. We probably get a lot of interest from like the UAE. Well, for the space powers, like UAE is doing some things now, and like Luxembourg and other places that are thinking, oh wow, this is an opportunity for us to put, you know, several $1 million or something to invest as a shareholder in this venture, and it generates a return. And then, but also I think that larger nations will also want to do it because they'll, even for them, you know, no nation could be able to finance the infrastructure at a level, infrastructure themselves at a level that would rival what you could do under a model like this, I think. So I think there's a strong incentive for nations to cooperate. We just need to make the case to them for doing that. Did that answer the question about, one of my biggest concerns actually is like making sure that people don't steer this or control it to serve their side interests, their political or their individual business interests, rather than you know, the LDC's interests and the moon's interests.
So let's continue around a couple of times. So Hoyt, I do want to bring in questions as well, but before I do that, I want Hoyt or Gary to ask follow-up questions or make follow-up comments or observations.
Yeah, I mean, I still see, the case you're making for the, you know, the development could be faster or ultimately more powerful with, you know, this participation in the system. But I think that I wonder how much you're acknowledging the like the national security interest that might drive the incentives for someone like China or United States, for that matter. You know, when thinking about relinquishing control of these, or even just participating until they don't think they need to anymore, and then bailing, and you know, and then going it alone. So I think that feeds into this, you know, judging the likelihood of investors to get on board. Certainly, I see an incentive for smaller countries to do this, but I think there's going to be, I would expect a large contingent in both China and the United States to say, well, we don't need to be part of this smaller outfit to move forward with our programs. That seems to be more the case for, say, China and Russia than maybe the United States, which is trying to gather allies with the Artemis Accords. But yeah, I wonder if you've gamed out like the scenario where you know, the Outer Space Treaty falls apart, or you know, and countries decide to use their military power to enforce their will on the moon. And
yeah,
plays.
Yeah, I'd really like to do that with this online game. Actually, is to have that as a component and see what turns out. And if that does turn out, figure out how we need to change it to what types of fixes we need to program in to it. And you know, I think that there's nothing in the LDC that would harm a nation's national security interests at all. In fact, there's probably lots of arguments we can make for why it supports national security interests. But anyway, yeah, those are good thoughts.
Yeah, and I guess I should add, there's nothing to stop the U.S. or Russia or China or anyone else from both being part of LDC and separately having their own installations on the moon for national security. Mm-hmm. They can do both, right? And they might want to do. The LDC is not claiming the entire surface of the moon, right? So other parties can go do whatever they want to. You know, again, it's the size of the Americas. There's a lot of land.
To clarify that, the LDC, if you're a member of the LDC, you're agreeing to certain non-interference clauses in the areas where there are members, but that still leaves the rest of it open for your own national bases or whatever. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, well, you could have, first, you can have these, a nation like the United States wants to set up a military or research station or something, government-owned, base on the moon. They could receive LDC services while using that and pay for those services to the LDC just like any other party there. And of course, there'd be shareholders too. So it's sort of, it's not like they're losing that money.
Yeah.
And same thing with China and other places. So you could still operate a military base as an LDC license holder, as an LDC customer. And also, nations that don't want to participate in the LDC, that don't want, or, if somebody doesn't want to be paying the LDC for its services, they could, still plop down on the moon, build whatever they want to, and just not get anything from the LDC and not pay anything to it either.
The idea is that if they do that, then they'll see the benefits they could be getting from joining the LDC,
right.
and it'll naturally incentivize them
right.
from getting on board.
It's like, oh, look, the LDC is providing you with power. You get to use this spaceport that they built. You get any number of things that it's like we would be lowering our costs so much by doing this.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And Michael, I saw a question someone asking about, can individuals be shareholders in LDC? And I think you feel very strongly that should be yes, and even to an extreme of like some kid in Africa buying a share for $1, right?
That's right. It should be like $1. We want to make the minimum investment as low as possible, and so that anybody can do it. So this might be, some new innovative trading platform for its shares or something like that. That way, LDC only grows stronger and stronger the more diversity there is in its shareholders. So you want people from very, very small investors, people who are, it should be affordable to become a shareholder, even on global standards, on the, very, very low incomes by global standards. You should still be able to buy, shares in the LDC.
We have another question. We have another question from someone who asks, how are LDC's services priced as all-inclusive recurring fee to the users?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so like I was saying initially, the LDC's overarching business model is to provide all these services to increase demand at particular spots on the moon, and then then collect the value that appreciates at that spot in the moon over time. That's where its real potential is from a financial perspective lies. And then now it's going to have short-term funding needs. They're going to need to deliver a short-term return on investments. And so in order to cover that, they could charge usage fees. But that question of how much they charge or what they give away for free to members as part of their all-inclusive LSAF charge, or what they charge individually for services, it's really kind of a business decision, and it sort of depends on, it would have to be sorted out like when the LDC really starts to move, and they could be changing that that model over time as they realize it makes more strategic sense to be including this as free just by being a member, or whether they need to charge for something.
Evaluators?
I have just a couple of comments related to the roadmap, right? So in the paper, there's some ideas outlined, and I know that I think it was not intended to detail those ideas, but I'm curious about the sequencing. And yeah, maybe this is one initial question I think for us to discuss.
Sequencing, like the next steps that we would take.
More like a roadmap of how you intend to implement the idea, right? Because yeah. I think overall, like you shared some suggestions of in terms of next steps, but I would like to see more like a timeline. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, I think that over the next year we could have really strong financial and economic models, giving a strong indication for what the LDC would generate for shareholders, but a few months to a year. And then we could also start to build the online game, for over the next couple of years, and have a beta version, and then gradually be improving that and bringing in more and more users of the game, selling the game more and more, and having subsequent versions. And is sometime in the next couple of years, we could be starting operations at simulated, at lunar analog bases on Earth, providing LDC, basically creating an LDC model for those habitats to see how it works there. And I mentioned working on native reservations with indigenous communities. We could be delivering services like remote sensing and stuff from Earth, from back to Earth. And so I think probably we could do all of that over the next sort of 5 years, and in the process be raising a lot of attention and awareness for the LDC model. And sometime around the end of that time, we could probably, we could have the LDC going from the very start, but we could, that's when we could really start to pull in some serious shareholders, both nations and private companies. But I think as soon as we're doing the financial and economic modeling, we could already start having conversations with SpaceX and Bezos and people at NASA and Luxembourg and Israel and other places that might be potential shareholders, and parties like SpaceX or lunar mining companies that could be anchor tenants.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Mike. Actually, we are getting close to the end of the official end of the program. I'm certainly fine with this going over, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, if everyone is okay with that, because I do have one more question here. I think we want to pull in from the group. Is Jim Dunstan still on the call? And maybe he asked a question relating to the Outer Space Treaty and compliance with that, and maybe just let him. He's a friend of the group, so we could let him ask directly if he's still here.
Hey, Steve. Yeah, I am.
Yeah, and then but before you ask, James, and then what I want to do after that is I want to give the evaluators one more opportunity to make any recommendations, based upon this conversation. What are the 1 or 2 things you would most recommend that Michael work on? And I think some of that is kind of obvious just from the conversation. And then secondly, the evaluators are being asked to fill out a questionnaire. I posted the questionnaire. Attendees are actually welcome to fill that out. We may or may not use that data. We're focusing on people that have a certain kind of expertise that they're applying to this and this evaluation. But it'd be kind of interesting to see. Certainly give your name and email in the name field. It'd be interesting, especially if you think that you have the background that's relevant for this. So kind of do welcome that. And then for the evaluators, just in general, if as you're working through the questionnaire, I'm sure Michael would be more than welcome to answer any additional questions via email or get on a call or whatever. So please don't feel like this is your last shot to ask Michael any questions. So that's sort of how we're going to play out the rest of the call here. And then with that, Jim, why don't I give you the floor for a second?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. Michael, I'd love to talk to you offline. In addition to being a space lawyer, I actually am a computer game lawyer as well, having both developed software and represented companies. So we can talk. But here's my question. It seems to me that as proposed, the big gating item you're going to have a problem with is running smack dab into sort of the knee-jerk, this is going to be a violation of the treaty regime, and having to sort of get bogged down in that. But let me flip this on its head and suggest to you that you think about it in terms of this. When I talk to folks who are interested in lunar development especially, one of the things they talk about is a total lack of standards because standards don't exist yet. The reason that we can build homes economically, notwithstanding the price of lumber currently in the United States, is everybody knows what the standards are. And this organization as a standard setting organization actually could have incredible amount of value that you could then bootstrap into it being the sort of governance body that you're proposing it as. When I talk to people, they say how incredibly expensive it is to develop just a coupler in space because the standards don't exist. So having an IEEE or an Underwriters Laboratory or UL for the moon as an entity to funnel that stuff through, I think would have such incredible value that you could then leverage that into the larger organization that you're talking about. And so I would suggest you think about that rather than just going in and saying, this is what we're going to do, and we'll figure out sort of the treaty implications of it later. Steve, thanks for the opportunity.
Okay. Well, Michael, if you want to react to that.
No, thank you for that. That's a great point.
Good. All right, well, gentlemen, yeah, I do want to give our evaluators an opportunity to give you their 1 or 2 top recommendations as you move forward. And Hoyt, I know you're integral to this. I don't know if anything that's come up today that makes you realize, wait a minute, we really need to focus on this or that.
Well, let me follow up on James' point because as we've mentioned, the indigenous community, not only Native Americans, but more broadly, have really kind of fallen in love with this concept because it's such a cultural fit with their heritage of non-ownership of the land. The land is a commons for all and to benefit all. And they are really, kind of fully on board supporting this, not only for potential, analog test sites on the Earth to sort of practice this, but also talking about support at the United Nations, to make sure we don't have problems like James was talking of hitting the Outer Space Treaty and this, and people saying, well, this is just kind of a sneaky land ownership. Because I think at its core, it's not land ownership. And I think, the indigenous community will kind of support that with us in the international, deliberations that are likely to be held over this. So, I don't know if Michael, you want to?
No, that's
further comment on that? Yeah.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're good with the plan as it is, Hoyt.
Well, the devil is in the details. It's still early phases. This is going to be a multi-year effort. There's a lot of work to do. We're going to need lots of contributions from the people on this call and elsewhere, before it gets to be a workable, final, adopted sort of. But I think it's promising. From all of the other models I've seen, like the Moon Village and other things, I think this is very interesting, deserving of the community's work to make it better.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Gary?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I think, coming from the perspective of, a space entrepreneur, new startup company, I think it would, in the presentation, I think it would benefit to sort of describe how the LDC is going to bring in a bunch of entrepreneurial companies to be able to deliver those services that the LDC promises to deliver, because the array of services you've listed are broad. And I know of many companies that intend to provide many of those services. So I think it would help to sort of add additional interest from the entrepreneur community.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's good.
And then Sidney.
That's no first. Congratulations, Mike. I think it's a great starting point for conversation. Very important about how we're going to be developing the moon, and I really like the approach of being more inclusive, and also making it or dealing with the challenges and opportunities that the land ownership aspect creates. One recommendation that I would make is try to simplify things, that in the sense that when I talk about innovation, the less moving parts we have in a system, I think the easier it is, I think, or the less complicated it makes it for it to be executed. So I hear a lot of very interesting concepts trying to be developed at the same time, right? So combining a new frontier like the moon with the idea of creating a consortium, a cooperative, and also adding crowdsourcing, I think adds complexity to the. So if you could simplify not only the the idea, but also the messages involved, it might make it easier for an audience that is not comprised of specialists to, I think, to understand a little bit better.
Cool, thanks.
Great. Well, we are past the hour as it is, and I'd like to thank Michael and our evaluators, Hoyt, Sidney, and Gary, for a great discussion. Again, evaluators, if you could look at the answers to the questionnaire and this discussion, as I said, will be summarized in a report, and that will be issued in the fall. And we're continuing this project. Right now, we're evaluating 3 different approaches. Anyone on this call that is familiar with maybe another model that we should be considering, we could add those. So certainly let us know. Again, if there's any on this call who feel they have the background that and would be interested in being an official evaluator, certainly we welcome you. Welcome to hear from you. Let me know. And so with that, I thank you all for taking the time. Michael, all the best to you in this plan. Super exciting. I was excited from the moment that I heard about it. So hopefully this continues to move forward and evolve over the weeks and months and years. So thank you all again, and we'll see you next week, the 29th at noon. Be on the lookout for an announcement about that. Okay. And with that, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Steve, for making this possible, and for all of the evaluators for your comments. It was very, very helpful. And so thanks for taking your time.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thanks.